So back to business for Newcastle United today, take on Tottenham Hotspur here at St James's Park in a game that really for me is an acid test now after what's happened in the transfer window. Didn't end in the greatest of fashion, but for me, as I said on Friday, Newcastle still do have a very good first 11 on paper. They've managed to retain their stars, and I think that they've got a real opportunity to do something this season still, regardless of what's happened. Yes, if injuries cut in, it's going to be difficult, but I think ultimately for Eddie Howe, he's got a real chance here, and I think he knows that as well. So for Newcastle against Tottenham, this is probably the first big test against one of the A-listers in the Premier League, if you like. Newcastle got a good record against Spurs here. Let's hope they can keep it up. The crowd are going to be right behind them this afternoon. Big backing for Sandro Tonali, who plays in his first big game since his ban. Got through over an hour at Nottingham Forest in midweek, so an opportunity for him to build on that. An opportunity for Newcastle to remain unbeaten in the Premier League after 3 games. Well, so far so good for Newcastle United at St James's Park. 1-0 up at half time thanks to that Harvey Barnes goal from a Lloyd Kelly cross. Really clinical finish, great technique, puts Newcastle in full control. Spurs probably have been on top at times in this game, but Newcastle United absorbed it, created their own chances, and are halfway there now. Can they hold on to it? Let's hope they can. Maybe if they can get that first goal in the second half, they'll be in a great position against Spurs. Nick Pope has made a couple of excellent saves, but ultimately Newcastle in control, closing in hopefully on 3 big points here at St James's Park. So an absolutely huge win for Newcastle United here against Tottenham Hotspur. It wasn't the prettiest of games at times, but Newcastle have held on for 3 precious points, and they look back on this as a huge moment in the season. You think that going into this game, we were under a little bit of pressure after what had and hadn't happened in the transfer window. It has to be said that one of the signings that they did make in pre-season in Lloyd Kelly had an absolutely fantastic game and provided the first goal for Harvey Barnes with a great cross. Then in the second half, it was all about Spurs. They got back into it, the Dan Burn own goal, but after that, Newcastle absorbed the pressure, they waited for the breaks, and eventually they found it. Joe Linton playing Jacob Murphy through, who crossed, and Isak just tapped home at the Leazer's end. It was a fantastic moment for the fans with the roof raised once again, and Newcastle after that just had to hold on to 3 points here, and that's exactly what they did. So they're still unbeaten after 3 games. They're in the next round of the Cup. They can go away and enjoy the international break now. And Newcastle United's chairman Yazir Al-Rahmanian watched on, even joined in with a bit of clapping as Newcastle fans celebrated going into closing stages. He was on his feet, he looked like he was enjoying it, and so he showed. Newcastle have held on to a massive win here against one of the top 4 rivals. 2-1 against Spurs. Newcastle can now put their feet up for a little while. So Newcastle United remain unbeaten in the Premier League. It was an unbelievable day for Newcastle in many ways, that they'd beaten one of the top 4, top 5 rivals in Tottenham Hotspur, and it was, this is one of the teams that they don't want Newcastle to push on. They don't want Newcastle to spend loads of money. They want to try and shut that down in all the Premier League. And Newcastle, have said all along that this was a tough window for them. Eddie Howe even talking about it in the press room after the game, saying how challenging it had been for Newcastle to try to get business done, and he knows now that that's behind Newcastle. They've got to get on with it. So it was a sweet victory against Spurs. I think nobody's going to hide that. Newcastle had a good record against Tottenham. Obviously won very heavily, 6-1 and 4-0 in the last two games here. But today was a bit different. It was a narrow win. They scraped it. They had plenty of opportunities in the first half to, make life a little bit easier for Newcastle. But second half, I have to say, Tottenham were on top for long periods of it. Newcastle, in the end, in the second half, were holding on. They were holding on for a point at one point, but thankfully they managed to get that break. Spurs had changed their tactics. They looked at other opportunities, and they looked at a way of trying to actually win the game by, tweaking it, and it didn't pay off. But the truth is, if Newcastle can learn to, pick up more wins like that, narrow wins, carved out wins, ground out wins, whatever way you want to look at it, then, that is the secret to, challenging in the top four. It was something they couldn't do last season. That's potentially a game that they might not have got anything from last season because the mentality just seemed weaker. Today they dug in. I thought the big characters stepped up when they were required, and thankfully Newcastle have got those 3 points on the board. I mean, just looking back on the game, I mean, Newcastle going ahead, probably slightly against the run of play, but they'd had other kind of glimpses of goal before that. But I think ultimately today Spurs were, the team that did not take the advantage when, they were in a position to get something from the game. When they were on top, getting back into it at 1-1, that was probably Newcastle's only real uncertain spell. I think, many shots from outside the box from Tottenham. But look, Newcastle, they absorbed it. They managed to come up with that counter, get the victory. And, that was a beautiful goal to watch. Jacob Murphy just breaking through, squaring it for Isak, and he just finishes at the Leazer's end. It was a brilliant goal to watch. You'd sometimes take those just as much as watching a 30-yard goal go in. It was that enjoyable. But thankfully now Newcastle, they're unbeaten. They go off for that international break now. They can put their feet up a little bit. Well, the non-internationals can. But as a club, they can put their feet up a little bit because they know that this has been a testing period, but one in which, they've got to the other side of it. And yes, the squad probably isn't as strong as it could have been, but we know why. PSR has been a nightmare for Newcastle. A lot of questions were asked in the last few days, but I think they've responded in exactly the right way by, getting those 3 points. I think that is the best way to reply sometimes to any type of criticism, is by winning, putting the ball in the back of the net, and that's exactly what Newcastle have done. Of course, there will be questions to be asked moving forward. The questions, will not always be answered by Eddie Howe. They'll be answered by people above him. But I think, really, future transfer windows, Newcastle might be able to do a lot more than they've done in this one. Eddie Howe alluded to it at his press conference, said they're going to have more freedom in the future. But, the proof will be in the pudding in the next transfer window, next summer as well. For now, all that's gone. They've got to focus on the players they have got. And I certainly think they did that today. So, big win for Newcastle. Enjoy the international break and we'll be back soon.